And it was just about how the startup industry kind of deals with depression and sadness and having to bounce back. One of the people she interviewed for that article was Michael A. Freeman, a psychiatrist and executive coach who has been a founder, then went back and became a psychiatrist to work with founders. This is a topic that rings very true for me. I find that we, as a community, can struggle a lot with how we deal with depression and sadness. And when failure happens, kind of how I mentioned earlier, once you've bounced back, you can have these really great articles where you read the follow-up and everything's awesome and they learn these great lessons. But when you're in the midst of failure, you can be dealing with a lot of emotional ups and downs. I'll come out with it because I hope more people do. I struggle with depression. It'll be something that's with me the rest of my life. I'll have months that I'm high and months that I'm low. And it's just something that I've had to learn to kind of incorporate into my life. Trying to find that community that helps you, support you emotionally, is just as important as finding those mentors who help you professionally. So, without further ado, I welcome to the stage. Do you like Jess or Jessica?
No, my byline is Jessica.
Okay.
Jess unless they need the extra syllables because they're mad.
And that's like me with Cassandra and Cass. So, yeah, Jess. There you go. So, Jess Bruder and Michael Freeman, take it away.
Thank you, Cass.
Welcome to Masterpiece Theatre. Yes. Thank you. Okay. Thanks for having us, Cass. This, as you were just told, is Dr. Michael A. Freeman. He is a psychiatrist. Sorry. He's a psychiatrist and teaches at UCSF. He's also an executive coach. He, for about a decade, was a co-founder and a CEO. He's held various C-level titles at VC-funded startups. And one of the reasons I found him, because as a practitioner of the dark arts of media, I am a professional stalker. I found him because he does a lot of research at the intersection of entrepreneurship and things that people don't like to talk about so much, which would be anxiety and depression. So I found him. And I was lucky I did, because I was working on a story for Inc., this was back in May, about the dark side of startups. And again, these are things that people aren't always entirely comfortable talking about in this kind of masters of the universe climate of boundless optimism, infinite growth. People don't really like to talk about the hangovers, the road bumps, again, the depressive moments, which are often pretty intrinsic to the process. So I found this character, and I was very lucky I did, for a topic people don't really want to talk about. I think the article got 42,000 shares. I have no idea how many people read it, but that's how many people shared it, which is good because one of the things, as Cass has been talking about here, is building community and getting people talking about it amongst each other and kind of watching out for each other. So without further ado, I'd like to get Michael talking. One thing that also prompted this, and I know has been of deep concern to Michael, has been in recent years a couple high-profile founder suicides of note. We lost Jody Sherman of Ecomom, Ilya Zhytomyrsky of Diaspora, and just the fact that, you know, again, you see people who appear to have everything, and everything appears to be so bright and shiny and great until it's not. So I think part of the question is, how do you get people talking before it gets that dark, and how do you get people acknowledging that they're not the only ones going through this hard stuff? So here we are. So I got permission in the very beginning. Dr. Freeman was kind enough to say that he would start off by being a little bit vulnerable with you. And because he's been in the trenches of business, he has a dark moment, and he'd like to share that with you. Will you take it away?
I will. Thank you. Can you guys hear me? Okay. So before I share a story with you, I just want to say that everything I'm about to tell you is true and accurate, but I'll be telling stories about some other CEOs, founders, co-founders, investors that I have worked with and do work with. And in those cases, I'm going to be scrambling a lot of the identifying information to protect everybody's confidentiality, but you'll get the main point of the story, which I think is germane to why everyone is here today. So regarding my own personal failure in business, well, I had worked with VC firms for quite a while doing startups in healthcare, and at a certain point I felt like time to move on and do my own thing. My friends and I put in $30,000, started a little business, with a big vision. We grew it 30% per year, year after year, and we always had 30% annual growth, 20%, 30% profit margins. It was doing great, and had tons of employees in multiple locations. And hello? Okay. Customers all around the country and in different countries. And when you've got the wind in your sails like that after a decade, you begin to feel like, okay, this is working. We know what we're doing. We're like killing it. And then all of a sudden we got disrupted because there was this massive roll-up and consolidation of our customer base. And our marketing people saw it coming. They were like showing me the data. I knew who was buying who and what companies were being merged, downsized, acquired, and so on. But having had 10 years of experience with nothing but growth, I wasn't able to respond quickly enough. We needed to downsize, right-size, reorganize, change our product mix much faster than we did. And as a result, we kind of got caught with our pants down and saw rapid decline in revenue, had to lay people off, and kind of cope with the fallout of that. So I remember my own emotional reactions at the time. It was devastating. First of all, I don't know about some of the other founders here, but by that time we had like 50, 60 employees. We were keeping all these families alive, going. They were great, high wage, high skill, good benefits kinds of jobs. And I had a lot of empathy for what's going to happen to everybody that this company can't support. And then, there's a little bit of seeing this vision that you had crumble right in front of your face and having grieving as a result of that. And so I remember some very sad, dark, confused moments. And I had to go through a lot of negative emotion before I could kind of snap out of it and make some tough decisions about how to restructure the company to be viable going forward, which we ultimately did. But it was just not going to be the same business anymore.
And you're a psychiatrist, so maybe it's a little different, but why don't mere mortals typically like to tell these stories? There may be a bit of a stigma attached. Why do we often hear the crushing at stories, but not quite so often the dark nights of the soul?
Yeah, I think that, so now I do research on entrepreneurship with colleagues from UC Berkeley and Stanford, and I coach a lot of founders, typically founders, sometimes investors. And then I also have a regular psychiatric patients practice where I just take care of people who have mental health issues. With the founder world and the entrepreneur world, I think one of the issues is shame. I think people feel that they will be diminished in the eyes of whoever is important to them if they can't tell a good story of meaning growth, returns, customer satisfaction, competitive advantage, that kind of thing. Shame and humiliation, I think, is part of it. I think another aspect of it, which fortunately didn't happen to me, but I've seen it happen to people I work with, is that the company becomes your life. And when the company goes away, what is left? And so there can be a huge void as a result of that.
Sure, if it subsumes your identity completely and then it's obliterated, where are you?
Right.
Which actually makes me want to talk about, this is funny, we've done an interview before. I obviously interviewed him for the magazine story, and I'm so used to doing this kind of undercover of secrecy just on the phone. And in some ways, this is just kind of like bringing it we've had this conversation before. I'm deja vuing a bit, but one of the most interesting things that you brought up to me when we were chatting that first time was there's this kind of matrix, cue the matrix. cue the matrix. Why aren't you cueing matrix? I took my button clicking, thank you. It's all on the wrist. One of the things you told me is that there's this kind of series of traits that lead to great success in entrepreneurship and tend to correlate with successful founders, but can also be a bit of a double-edged sword in that at a certain level these traits are great, and then they may start to tip and actually cause some troubles. So can we talk about that a bit?
So one of the things that comes from the research literature on entrepreneurship, I summarized in this one slide just to kind of give you a visual of what is known. It turns out there's a vast literature on entrepreneurship. And it's been studied from almost every angle you can imagine and a few angles that you haven't imagined. And this slide here summarizes about 42,000 studies. This is a meta-analysis, or these are actually two meta-analysis. What that means is that you have a lot of studies and then you study the studies and find out what are the common themes. And these are studies of the personality profile of successful entrepreneurs. What the findings are is that there actually is a profile, and that many of these characteristics may apply to some of you in some way. And as Jess was saying, and I'll explain what these are, but as Jess was saying, this is by and large a good thing, but you can have too much of a good thing. And so each of these characteristics can help you in some ways, but they can undermine your success in other ways.
Absolutely. Risk tolerance, I know, is one we talked about quite a bit.
Yeah, risk tolerance. Okay, so the other thing I should say before kind of getting into this is that much of this is genetic. Recently there's a consortium in Europe which is doing what they call genome-wide association studies of entrepreneurs, and they're identifying kind of the predictive genetic regions of chromosomes that are associated with the propensity to become an entrepreneur. So you guys out here have essentially won the genetic lottery. You have these traits like extroversion, motivation, positive affect, what you see up here, which most people would kill for. Lots of energy, lots of enthusiasm, creativity. But risk propensity is one of these traits. And risk propensity is exactly what it sounds like. It's the likelihood that you will take a risk in a situation where the outcome is unknown. Of course, entrepreneurs believe that they're smarter and they have deeper knowledge, and so they know what the outcome is going to be. So for them, it's not a risk. It's a calculated risk, if you want. So the propensity to take risks is great up to a point, and there's been a lot of research on the correlation between the success of an enterprise, or within a larger corporation, the success of an executive and that person's risk propensity. What it turns out is that it's an inverse curve, that at a certain point your willingness to take risk and your likelihood of taking a risk gives you an advantage, and you'll be there first, and you'll spot the opportunity, you'll jump on it, you'll throw resources at it, and you'll be there ahead of the crowd, and you'll get a toehold. But then later on in the life of the enterprise, you can take risks that are not so well advised and begin blowing things up. So it's one of these things where it's a good thing, but it can turn on you and be nasty as well.
Just enough, but not too much,
right.
Sort of situation.
Right.
Interesting. So when we're looking at, again, people like those in this room, people who display these traits, which are unfamiliar to others among us, but what can if people are saying, oh, I recognize that might be me, what can people look out for in themselves. It would be great to talk about others too, but just to look out for in themselves, to kind of be aware, and also to try to prevent hitting the shoals, encountering the kind of depression and anxiety, the serious low moments, the dangers that we've talked about.
Yeah, that's a good question. So in terms of what's the one thing I'm going to start doing tomorrow after you leave the conference from this discussion, would be to identify in what way are you vulnerable, and how does that vulnerability, how could it lead to adverse business results? And so let me start by talking about vulnerability. So an example of this is that a bunch of guys go out in a Humvee in Iraq, and their Humvee blows up. They hit a roadside bomb, and 30% get post-traumatic stress disorder, and 70% don't. What's different about that 30%? So coming into your entrepreneurship journey and your entrepreneurship experience, you bring some baggage. You bring a personal history, you bring a family history, and you may bring a predisposition to some kind of mental health issues, for example. You may have had some adverse events earlier in your life. The ones that are particularly of concern would be early, like traumatization in childhood, bereavement in childhood, for example, can predispose. But you also bring your own personality, which has strengths and weaknesses. So I think a good place to start is to understand both what your strengths are and play on your strengths. As Julie was talking about earlier today, she knew what her strengths were. She is a visionary, and she has a big vision, and it's the right vision, and it's the right vision at the right time. And speaking as a physician, we now have 50 million new people coming into the healthcare system and no new doctors. Nobody has exactly explained how that's supposed to work. We need Julie to succeed, and I think she will. And so she could play on her strength. But she also has a weakness. Julie, are you still here anywhere? Oh, okay. I'm telling stories out of school, but I think a lot of you, she's not the only one. Virtually everybody in entrepreneurship has this weakness, which is when things are exciting, it's really exciting. And you become activated. And in the research world, we call this goal activation. Think about a panther or a cheetah who's chasing a gazelle. What does that cheetah feel like? Activated. It's exciting. You're on. You're mobilized.
You're Charlie Sheen.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, that's a good one. We can talk about Charlie Sheen, and Charlie Sheen is not on that map, but he's a good reference point. And so when people are activated and mobilized like that, they become disinhibited. That means you take the brakes off and you buy the shoes. And you can become impulsive. So what we've seen over and over again in the entrepreneurship world is that goal pursuit is activating and goal attainment is euphoric. When you get the goal, when you see the numbers going up on your user count, or when you close the round, or when you IPO, it's euphoric. And people lose it. So there was in the last dot-com boom, there was a story about a CEO who after the IPO, went and bought a Maserati, drove it up the coast of California, and drove over a cliff and died. Very disinhibited. So I would say, so that's like a vulnerability. You've got to understand that in this context, I might spin out in this way and be able to mitigate that as you go forward. So that's an example.
That's helpful for prevention. So kind of know thyself while you're still sober before you get behind the wheel on the ground. so you know what's going to happen when things get
Right,
a
and
little
one of
hepped
these
up.
characteristics is achievement, motivation, and striving. And it means exactly what it says it means, that people are very goal-oriented and have big goals. And then once they identify a goal, they get activated, and they don't quit, they begin to strive, and as they strive, you begin to lose sleep. I doubt if that ever happened to anybody in this room,
No.
but I definitely have seen it happening. And then you become sleep deprived, and then your ability to function deteriorates. So it can be a negative feedback loop in that way.
Is there anything else you'd like to share with them about prevention before I jump you forward to first aid? Sleep.
Prevention, well, yeah. I would say regarding prevention, how do you prevent bad things from happening before you get there? I would say remember that you work to live, you're not living to work. It's hard. It's a hard message, and it's a very inconsistent message with the way people are wired in the entrepreneurship world. But I'll tell that story about this guy that I met with recently. So this gentleman was a billionaire, and he was making money hand over fist, and he was running the best company in the best space, and he was on boards of directors, and he was on the board of the university, and he was getting all kinds of recognition. And then the recession hit, and he was just horribly positioned for the recession, because I think, kind of like me, he'd had a whole life of success. He's now 70. Why is that going to change? And it did. And company went into Chapter 11. He was wiped out personally. He only had $2 million left, and he became very depressed, suicidal, hospitalized at a psychiatric hospital, released, came to meet with me. And same story. His story was, I'm 70. It's too late for me to ever do this again. Nobody will return my phone call, which is the stigma. It's true. It's kind of like you have cancer. Nobody will return the phone call. Nobody wants to talk with you. And I'm washed up. I'm going to, life is worthless. Life is meaningless. I'm hopeless. I'm a failure. And so I'm just going to live my lifestyle for the next 2 or 3 years, and then after that, when the money's gone, I'm going to commit suicide. That was his story. He totally believed that. So I said, all right, now, explain this to me. You live in a beautiful home in this great zip code that's all paid off, and you have a beautiful vacation home in Europe, and you have another beautiful vacation home in Hawaii, all paid off. And your wife, who divorced you because you didn't pay enough attention to her, is still your friend. And you have 3 children, all grown up, doing well, and 4 grandchildren who adore you. Now, tell me, why life is not worth living? But in his mind, life was not worth living. He forgot that there's more to life than just how big your bank account is. And it's kind of a variation on the theme of your net worth has to be different from your self-worth. And so if you're thinking about how do you want to prevent yourself from getting derailed as you go into these enterprises, figure out how to have a sense of self-esteem that's based on something else, or at least something in addition to your prowess and your success as an entrepreneur. Because remember, statistically, only 1% of people can be in the top 1%. That's just the way it is.
Are you telling them to diversify their emotional investments?
Diversify your emotional investment. That's
Sorry.
a good way to say it. I like that. Yes. You have a family, you have hobbies, you have friends from high school, you have the nonprofit organization that needs somebody with your IQ to be helping. Yes, diversify your engagements and diversify where you derive your sense of self-worth from.
Absolutely. I mean, when I was interviewing folks for the story, we had people who would go on long runs. We had people who would lock themselves in their bedrooms and play Stevie Ray Vaughan solos all day long. But people needed something else to do, something else at which they could feel successful. So there wasn't just one metric to what was driving their lives when that one metric kind of hit a road bump. Well, we promised Cass first aid, so I think we should do a little bit of that. If you do find yourself in the pit, how do you climb out?
First of all, I would say for all of you who have colleagues, friends, or if you're working for somebody who is going under, friends don't let friends drive drunk. Don't be polite. Tell them you need help. As Jessica said, there have been a bunch of suicides, people we know, people we really loved and cared for, people who have been making great contributions and should have made more because there wasn't an early enough intervention. Recognize warning signs. You've been hearing about depression and anxiety. That happens a lot. Other mental health issues pop up. Bipolar disorder, ADHD, drug and alcohol abuse. And so in each of these areas there are warning signs, and if you want to ask me questions about it, I can kind of go into that. But there are early warning signs. Know what the early warning signs are. When you see them, do not wait, because it gets worse. You go over an emotional tipping point, and then you're in a downward spiral.
Can you give them just prescriptively some of these signs, what to look for?
Well, yeah, let's say with depression, if you begin to feel low energy, loss of motivation, lack of enthusiasm, you're not enjoying, life is no longer pleasurable. You're no longer the cheetah chasing the gazelle. Like, who cares about the gazelle? I'm just going to stay in bed. A sense of low self-esteem, a sense of lack of hope in the future, a feeling that life is just not worth living, like the billionaire with everything to live for. That is a sign of depression. It's treatable. We know what to do. Ask for help. With respect to anxiety, your worry, rumination, panic attacks, shyness, avoidance of situations you would otherwise not avoid, becoming overly compulsive. These are anxiety symptoms, and there's ways to help with that. Substance abuse. If you find that you're just thinking about when am I going to have my next drink, you got a problem. So I've worked with a bunch of CEOs who have found a way to normalize addiction and explain it away. One guy I work with who is a really brilliant CEO and has done a great job of starting a company in the big data space. Really, part of his success is that he lands these big clients because they have fun hanging out with him. Why do they have fun hanging out with him? Because he throws good parties. What happens at the good parties? Binge drinking. And so it was work for him to begin to understand that his strength was also part of a weakness, and that he had an addictive, personality. So those are some of the warning signs to be aware of.
So once the red flags appear, can you give us some advice on what folks can do?
Well, I think acknowledge it. Well, actually, okay, so since you listened to what I said previously, now you already have friend and family support, you already have confidants, you already have a professional mentor, you already have an advisory board. So those prevention people are in place. Tell them, hey, here's what's going on. I'm feeling like I'm over my head. This is getting out of control. I'm out of my depth. I want you to know about it and help point me in the right direction. So that's one thing that you can do. If people come to you and tell you that you better, you know what, I'm going to drive you back to the hotel. After this was a great sales meeting, I'm going to drive you back. And by the way, I had to drive you back last time, and the time before that, I think there's a problem. If they tell you that, listen to them. And then, back to stigma, don't be ashamed. Call someone like me, or there's a million mental health professionals out there, and get some expert advice, and then listen to people that you ask for help. And a lot of people in the world of that slide think that they don't have to ask for help because they're so in charge and they know what to do. Self-efficacy is that middle box, and self-efficacy means that you have a lot of confidence that you will know what to do and that you can handle any situation. And sometimes that's been so right that you are now the CEO of the company with the biggest market cap in history, and it turns out you have liver cancer, and you've always known what to do in the past, and so, yeah, of course, I know what to do. Why should I listen to the experts? I never listen to the experts, and I'm always right. Sometimes you need to listen to the experts. So, reach out and ask for help.
Any advice for people who might see these kind of vulnerabilities cropping up in a friend or a colleague, the kind of person who, because of this integral self-efficacy, this trait that helped create the same entrepreneurial success, is now reticent to reach out for help? Any advice for interventions on that front?
Well, yeah, going back to my statistics, we already know going into the deal that 5 out of 6 companies will fail. You know that. And so if your company hits the skids and you're getting disturbed, or your buddy, the CEO, is getting disturbed, first of all, try to help normalize the circumstances. You know what? We have been making great typewriters for a long time, and yeah, these word processors came out, and yeah, nobody's going to need typewriters anymore. But that doesn't mean you should crash and burn. You actually were really successful for a really long time, and it doesn't take away anything from you. Second, if they're in denial, if they're not listening, you have to confront and do some kind of an intervention. But get on their radar screen and get them to attend. And then if you're working with one of these CEOs and that person is not getting the message, I would say you should resign, because you no longer have confidence in the leadership of your company. But as you resign, you should explain why you're resigning. And again, encourage this person to take stock before, other people resign and customers resign and suppliers resign. So those are some of the things I'd recommend.
All right, I think we've got room for one more area before we jump to the Q&A, in which I'm going to encourage you to be vulnerable. You've got free psychiatry right here, so step up, get naked. He's ready for you. In any case, can you tell us a little bit about the entrepreneurial work that you're doing right now? Because when I was working on the Inc. story, I had a whole banker's box full of journal articles I was reading, just trying to learn more about the science. And I was really surprised by how very few of them actually delved into the overlap between entrepreneurial mindsets and anxiety, depression, just these kind of correlated traits. I found a lot on one and a lot on the other, but not a lot in the middle of that Venn diagram. And I'm excited that you're working on expanding that area.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you for asking me. So again, this slide here is a synthesis of 60 or 90 studies of like 42,000 entrepreneurs. So I'm part of a research team with a professor from UC Berkeley. I'm at UCSF. Our research assistant is at Stanford. And we are looking at the predictors of entrepreneurial success and the predictors of failure, so that the intention would be how to if you have strengths that in fact predict your success, how to identify those and how to strengthen those. If you have like an Achilles heel that is possibly going to be a weakness as you enter into your venture, how can you proactively create risk management strategies around those weaknesses? So hopefully if Cass will agree to let me send you guys an email sometime around March or April, I'll invite you to go online and take a survey, and a year from now I'll be able to come back and tell you, here's what we found about the predictors, particularly in this conference, what predicts failure. Been a lot of research on what predicts success, very little on what predicts failure.
So do it for science. That's the wrap up there. All right, so are we ready to switch over to Q&A?
About 5 minutes for Q&A. 3 questions. One over there. There's a mic.
Yeah, hi, I've got a question. You talked a lot about when leadership is dealing with these challenges, but how about the sort of down the organizational structure? We had an employee who it became clear had some real problems, and he eventually told us he was performing horribly in his job, and he eventually conceded that he knew he was suffering from bipolar disorder. It appeared he was not being treated. We had to balance accountability in our organization with just basic human compassion and try to treat this person decently. But meanwhile, they were clearly not going to be able to help us as a company. Can you give any guidelines besides the legal issues? And what about just from your perspective? How do you balance the compassion with the accountability in an organization?
Really good question. First of all, I have to say that I do work with a number of bipolar entrepreneurs. And, in the hypomania, there is a lot of creativity, a lot of energy, a lot of charisma, and many people in that spectrum can be very, very successful. In fact, I think that you'll see a lot of that in the world of entrepreneurship, and people that are attracted into startups, not just the founders, but anybody that wants to be in a startup. This is really visionary and beautiful. What companies do, first of all, is they have something called an employee assistance program. And the employee assistance program basically says that anybody in this company may have 3, 5, 10 free visits with a mental health professional if you think you have a mental health issue. We don't want to know about it, but get help. And then after that, you can have another 3, 5, 10, and we'll pay half. And then after that, you got health insurance. So make it easy to get help. And then the second thing would be, you're right. I mean, legally speaking, you're not allowed to ask about that when you hire somebody, and you're not allowed to fire somebody for that reason. And in fact, these people are protected by the Americans with Disabilities Act, so you want to watch out for that too. But you can manage people properly in a way where you say, hey, you're late to every single meeting, you lose important documents, you flew into the wrong airport when we went to our convention, and this is having a negative impact on your performance and on the rest of our team. You don't have to say, do you have ADD? But what you can do is look at the downstream impacts on performance and wonder, could it be that there's something bigger going on that I don't get and you don't get? And if you want to get a second opinion about that, feel free to. But ultimately, people with mental health issues, like the CEO who was an addict, have to take responsibility for their own mental health issues. But at the same time, there's no shame in that. It should be, there is a higher than average amount of mental health issues among entrepreneurs and startup people. And average is 30% of the population has a mental health issue. So, you know, look to the right, look to the left, one of you has a mental health issue. Yeah. Oh, and nobody's over there. So I guess one of my take-homes is let's destigmatize this, because strengths are weaknesses. Strengths can be weaknesses in a different context. Weaknesses can be strengths in a different context. Let's mainly focus on building on the strengths and managing risks associated with the weaknesses.
Break us there, 'cause I know Mike is sticking around for a while. So, great. Thank you both so much for your time.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you both. Now again, the importance of this to me is that idea of looking at those around you and being a support structure for them, so that when you need it, they are available for you. I think that more of us than like to discuss have struggles with anxiety, with depression, and it's just important to incorporate that into part of your drive for success.